John Wick Chapter 4 is the final John Wick movie. That is it. John Wick's story is over. Yeah, I was surprised too, as the movie was not marketed that way. Now that the main John Wick franchise is over, how does the final chapter, John Wick Chapter 4, compare to the previous 3 movies, which are all held at an incredibly high regard? Which movie has the superior story, action, and characters, and how do these movies rank against each other? We are about to find out. Let the battle commence. All of these movies continue right where the last one left off. Now, aside from Chapter 2, the plot for all the John Wick movies is very thin and mostly revolves around John going from point A to point B. The story for Chapter 1 is that John comes out of retirement to get revenge on a mob boss's son who killed his dog and stole his car. John Wick 2 shows John reacquire his car, and right when he's finally about to grieve in peace, he gets an unexpected visit from Santino D'Antonio, who says that John must repay the debt that he promised or else he will kill him. John begrudgingly repays the debt, but then the sleazeball tries to have him killed as a loose end. John gets his revenge and breaks the assassin's code by killing D'Antonio on continental grounds. This causes John to be on the run as it's open season and a huge reward for the assassin that kills him. John Wick 3 continues right where Chapter 2 leaves off and has John on the run and in constant survival mode. And John Wick Chapter 4 is about John trying to exonerate himself of his crimes against the High Table so he can reclaim his freedom. Now, when watching John Wick 4, about halfway through the movie, I was thinking to myself, I'm really enjoying this, but I don't know if I could watch it again like the last 3 movies. And most importantly, I don't get why this one had to be nearly 3 hours. But then we got to the end and I was like, oh, so that's why it was 3 hours. I changed my mind. Not only can I watch this again, but I want to watch it again right now, because it turns out this is the last movie, and I didn't even know this was going to be the end. I remember hearing that there was going to be a John Wick Chapter 4 and 5, so I was surprised to find that this was John Wick's final chapter, and that instantly made the longer runtime justifiable. And this is one last long mission for John Wick, and it especially helped that the movie never felt like it was overstaying its welcome, because there was such a variety with its scenes and set pieces that you never got bored, which surprised me, because as much as I love John Wick, I was not ready to watch a near 3-hour movie. In terms of the story, the weakest link of these movies is John Wick 3. The first movie establishes this world and brings John Wick out of retirement. John Wick 2 ends with him killing his employer on continental grounds and then being excommunicated, which opens the door for the sequels, and John Wick 3 is just a filler chapter. The story never progressed like it did with chapters 1, 2, and 4. So all the movies pull their weight with regards to moving the plot forward, except Chapter 3, which just felt like a side mission. So I really take issue with the story for Chapter 3. The only problem with Chapter 4 is that they could have told the same story in a shorter runtime, whereas Chapters 1 and 2 told their stories with the perfect amount of time, and they took advantage of all the story options available to them. Whereas I did feel that Chapter 4 wasted a lot of opportunities that the previous movies had set up for it, even going as far as leaving a bunch of potential returning characters on the table. So although I liked the story for Chapter 4, the John Wick movies with the superior story is Chapter 2, Chapter 1, Chapter 4, and finally, Chapter 3. The action in the John Wick movies is what really put this franchise into the spotlight, and the main takeaway, aside from Keanu Reeves doing his own stunts, was the constant headshots which have become a trademark of John Wick's fighting style. My only complaints with the action in John Wick 1 was the hand-to-hand combat, which was just mediocre when compared to the amazingly choreographed shootout scenes. The action in the second movie was an improvement in every way over the first movie, and it even addressed my complaints with the hand-to-hand action sequences and made them so much better. As much as I enjoyed it, I personally wasn't blown away by the action in the first John Wick like everyone else was. The second movie, on the other hand, got me on board the John Wick hype train from then on, and the action in the third movie got even better. The opening action scene alone had so much variety with this action, and we still had almost the entire movie left. And there are so many staple and iconic action sequences in this movie. I would arguably say John Wick 3 has the most iconic and memorable set pieces of the whole franchise. That being said, I did find the action to get kind of repetitive and tired sometimes. For example, I started to get a bit bored when they continuously smashed John Wick through all of this glass. I also didn't like how these two assassins constantly gave him chances. I get that they are fans, but for all the talk of how invincible John Wick is, he would have been killed several times during this fight, and there was the odd bit of flipping around that got a bit grating and tired in this fight too. And I thought it was really ridiculous that Winston and the concierge didn't give these guys armor-piercing rounds, as they didn't stand a shred of a chance. But those few complaints aside, I thought the action in John Wick 3 was absolutely stunning, and it managed to top the action in the previous two movies. This is where I was thinking, how on earth are they going to top this? And well, they did. For the most part. I don't think the knife fight was as good in this movie as it was in Chapter 3, but man, the action that did so much better than Chapter 3 was everything in the final hour of the movie. The action here was non-stop, and I was shocked at how much variety was all encapsulated in this final long action sequence. The dragon breath rounds were amazing, and they were visually stunning to watch. Keanu even uses nunchucks and uses them in combination with his guns, and it was so cool. The only thing that really distracted me in this movie is that John Wick takes so much abuse even by these movie standards, and he keeps getting back up. And I was willing to give it a pass with the previous movies, except for this scene in Chapter 3 where he falls off a freaking roof, but Chapter 4 actually goes even crazier than this. I kid you not. In Chapter 3, he gets knocked out and brutally injured when he falls this high, but in Chapter 4, he has 2 drops like this, and then he gets right back up and starts beating a room full of assassins. And stuff like that went too far for me that it kind of pulled me out of the movie. So I wish the director Chad Stahelski would have pulled back with these death-defying injuries that John takes, because he crossed the line of plausibility even by this franchise standards, and it was genuinely distracting. So yeah, the action in all the movies is great, but Chapter 3 and 4 both elevate the action and somehow find a way to make it even better. The action was great in the first movie, but aside from the gun combat, I thought the hand-to-hand action was mediocre. That is something that Chapter 2 massively fixed, and the subsequent movies even more. That being said, I thought the action set pieces early on in John Wick 4 were good, but they weren't as good as the early action scenes in Chapter 3. What with book food, the knife fight, the horse fight, and even the motorcycle fight. Now, as I said, the action in Chapter 4 got better than Chapter 3 in the last hour, but still, I immediately wanted to rewatch the action set pieces in the previous John Wick movies, whereas the action in the first half of Chapter 4 was very good, but it felt less special and iconic, and I didn't have that instant urge to see them again. In spite of that, I still had a ton of fun, and the scene that got the most laughs out of me in Chapter 4 is when they're fighting on the road and the cars knock into the bad guys and John shoots them on the way down. This stuff was some of the most fast-paced action we have ever seen from the John Wick franchise, and that's saying something. And the sound design was fantastic. So were the camera angles, the colors, the staging, the cinematography, and the action scene on the stairs where John Wick and Donnie Yen team up and we see their teamwork skills. It was so much fun and shows what close friends they used to be. Really, that last hour of Chapter 4 was phenomenal. It's just the action in the first hour that didn't feel like it had escalated itself as well as Chapter 3 did. Also, the early action scenes with Chapter 4 did get a little bit scattered and unfocused when they tried to show an army of assassins fighting at the same time, whereas the John Wick franchise is at its best when they have 1 or 2 fights going on at a time. But still, the action is really good, and by the time we got to the last hour of the movie, it was non-stop some of the best action we have gotten from the John Wick franchise. So with that said, the movie with superior action is John Wick Chapter 3, John Wick Chapter 4, John Wick Chapter 2, and finally, John Wick Chapter 1. The most surprising thing about John Wick Chapter 4 is that the side characters were so good. Arguably too good. They are given their own brief backstories, and it really makes you interested to know what their stories were. In the previous movies, the side characters would be cool too, but aside from their casting, there was nothing really impressive with the writing of their characters. But in John Wick 4, I mean, we have long scenes where Donnie Yen's character is getting some full-on development, and we find that the Marquis have threatened to kill his daughter unless he obeys their orders and kills John Wick and anyone else they assign him to, and I was so into it. The same with Hiroyuki Sanada and his daughter. The movie establishes that all these characters have a past with each other where they were friends, and every time Donnie Yen's character had to confront his friends, he is very reluctant about it, and it brings him no joy, which really brought some dimension to him and made him very sympathetic. And honestly, this stuff was so interesting that for the first time in these movies, John Wick was the least interesting character to me. So much so that I actually found myself disappointed when it cut back to him at one point. Usually when you get the other characters in the John Wick films, they are cool temp characters that are a foil for John until he kills them, or are side characters like the Concierge, the Bowery King, and Winston who only show up occasionally for a scene and then we get back to John Wick. But he is always the center of attention and the most interesting character in the first 3 films. But in Chapter 4, I found all these other characters to be much more interesting. So much so that it almost felt like I was watching a foreign movie with the Osaka scene, which is very impressive. These side characters are so good that I actually found myself wanting to see them in their own spin-off movies, one of which is potentially teased at an end credit scene. And let me tell ya, I'm down for it. And what makes it even better is that this movie managed to set up a spin-off without forcing it like what the MCU has been doing with its credit scenes post-Endgame. It felt like there was actual effort put into setting up the future of the John Wick universe. Now, another reason I was more interested in watching them than John Wick is because Keanu Reeves' acting was terrible in this movie. Now, he wasn't terrible all the way through, he definitely had his good moments, but he had a lot that just fell flat. Kinda like him in John Wick 3. Lines that should be badass are just terrible. Even lines that he has delivered so well before, like,
"Yeah,"
sound really bad, and more like instead of saying,
"Yeah,"
he's saying,
"Yeah."
Most of his lines sound like a question rather than a remark or statement, even when he's making threats.
What about you, Mr. Vic?
I'm going to kill you.
And that makes his performance and his character this time round less charismatic. I mean, just listen to these two threats that he delivers back to back, and you tell me which one is the superior performance.
Whoever comes, I'll kill them. I'll kill them all.
What about you, Mr. Vic?
I'm going to kill you. What do you need? Guns. Lots of guns. I'm going to need a gun.
You see what I mean? These lines would have sounded so cool if Keanu maintained his acting from the first 3 films, but he doesn't, and they sound terrible.
I'm going to need a gun.
So yeah, Keanu's John Wick performance was the worst in this movie, and it just made me think that maybe he's kind of tired of playing this character. But his lackluster performance really did bring the character of John Wick down in this movie, which is not good considering this is supposed to be his goodbye.
A little far from home, aren't you?
Now, some people didn't like that they made Donnie Yen blind in this movie, and honestly, I really didn't mind it. It made him a different kind of opponent, and he does hint as to why he lost his eyesight, and he says he did it himself. So I'm actually interested to learn why he did that in a potential spin-off. Is it realistic? No, but we know that already with these movies, and it made him a formidable foe, yet also one that has an Achilles heel, and that made his fight scenes really interesting and unique to watch. Now, I have talked about the rest of the pre-existing side characters in my previous John Wick Versus videos, so if you want to know my thoughts on them, then you can rewatch those. But as far as the rest of the side characters go, it's no competition. The John Wick movie with superior characters is Chapter 4, Chapter 2, Chapter 1, and finally, Chapter 3. Something I found interesting is that John Wick Chapter 4 is the first of the series to have no opening titles, which is a shame as I always enjoyed those. Something else I realized looking back is that in the first 2 John Wick movies, everyone feared him. You mention his name, it would cause the most intimidating of mob bosses to tremble. You find out he is at your doorstep, you would be petrified. But in John Wick Chapters 3 and 4, it's like no assassins fear him anymore, and I do miss that. In my opinion, these 4 movies have been very consistent. The filmmaking got significantly better with each installment, and there was never a bad John Wick movie. They differed in quality, and everyone had their own favorites, and if they do decide to leave the franchise here, then they left it on one heck of a high note. It's time for the scores. John Wick Chapter 1 was a good start to me, but I didn't think it was as badass as everyone else did, so I give it a 7 out of 10. Chapter 2, on the other hand, was to me what Chapter 1 was to everyone else. The action was much improved, the unwinnable situation that John Wick finds himself in was very engrossing and well written, the fact that John was going up against assassins and not mob thugs really upped the stakes, and I found myself rooting even more for John to kill the villain this time. And to this day, it is still one of my most favourite action movies of all time, and it still gets a 10 out of 10. John Wick Chapter 3 was a filler chapter that had very little impact on the actual story and ultimately left John in the same situation that he was when the movie started, injured and on the run. Regardless, it was still a very fun ride with some of the best action of the series, so it gets a low 8 out of 10. And John Wick Chapter 4, I feel like I need to watch it again to know my score for certain, and well, it's a good thing I did. Yup, I watched it again so I could give you my definitive score. The first time I saw it, John Wick 4 was so close to being my favourite, and in many ways was my favourite. And now that I've seen it again, it has gotten even better on my second viewing. The action in the first half of the movie was even more enjoyable the second time round, and I still think that it is so close to being my number 1 favourite. But as is, my score for John Wick Chapter 4 is a strong 9 out of 10. This is my second favourite of the John Wick movies. The twist and turns with the story for Chapter 2 and the more tightly and smartly written story left me jaw-dropped, and that's why Chapter 2 is still my favourite. But Chapter 4 is still amazing. The action was so great, and the amount of creativity they were constantly coming out with was absolutely mind-blowing. They even do one shootout scene which reminded me of a game I played years ago called Hotline Miami, although Chad Stahelski says that he took the game Hong Kong Massacre as inspiration, and how they combined that concept with one continuous shot was unbelievable. It was so good in fact that I thought to myself, they're really not leaving any ideas left for the next movie, are they? And again, just like with the 3-hour runtime, once we got to the end, I was like, oh, that's why they used up all their ideas. We all thought that Keanu Reeves would be forever remembered primarily for Neo in The Matrix, but not anymore. He will now primarily be remembered for John Wick, and that is no easy feat, and I am kind of sad that this is going to be his last movie, especially because I was not prepared for it. They never said in any of the marketing or promotional materials that this is going to be the end of his story. Could it have been told better? Yes, but I am still incredibly satisfied with the way it was told in the end, and even after having watched it the second time, I really can't wait to see it again. A big thanks to my patrons whose continuous donations have really helped support me and make it possible for me to do this for a living. We are currently sitting at 45, and as I previously said, once we hit 100, as a celebration, I will get to work on my How to Train Your Dragon Trilogy Versus video. Remember, if you donate just $1, you will gain access to a ton of additional content such as trailer reactions and podcasts. And once I revise my Patreon, there will be even more content options for the different tiers. So you will definitely want to stay tuned for that, as there is going to be a ton of exclusive content coming there. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I really do appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Comment below and let me know what you thought of John Wick Chapter 4 and which of the 4 movies is your favourite. As always, thank you very much for watching, guys, and I will catch all of you very soon. Take care.